What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the GoPro Hero4 Silver Edition up against the Garmin Virb-XE. Now there's a lot to go over here where we have a ton of information between both of these cameras, everything from video quality to features, you name it. Or you can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. Otherwise, sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a bit. But trust me, there's a lot here to be excited about. Anyway, let's get to it. So we're going to start off by taking a look at the various field of view options available in both of these cameras. Now, unlike many other action cameras, both of these cameras will allow us to change the field of view quite significantly. So with the Hero4 Silver, we have the ability to go wide, medium, narrow, and there's also super view, which is kind of a special rule to the field of view option. And then with the Garmin Virb-XE, we have wide, zoom, and ultra zoom. So zoom and ultra zoom are basically the equivalents of medium and narrow field of view. So depending on which field of view option we're in, we're going to get some different results when it comes to things like lens distortion. Now it's true, lens distortion will appear less when we're in sort of medium or zoom type modes. The reason is because as we get farther away from the center of the lens distortion on each of these cameras becomes more extreme. So when we're cropping in on the image sensor, we're actually just sort of cutting out where we would have started to see some of that lens distortion become more extreme. So we're not really removing it as we are just sort of obscuring it. Now, the GoPro Hero's max potential at 30 frames a second is 2.7K, but if we want to change the field of view over to narrow, we actually had to switch it to 1920 by 1080. So that's what we have right here in order to enable narrow. The Garmin Virb-XE can basically only go up to 1920 by 1080 when we're doing a 16 by 9 format, and throughout that it can do wide, medium, and narrow field of view, and so could the Hero4 Silver for that instance. Now we also have super view, which is basically taking a 4:3 aspect ratio, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later, but we're actually using the sort of extra room on the image sensor, squishing that down into a 16 by 9 image to kind of get these results. Now we're sort of quickly going through all the different type of zoom options here, and you can quickly see just basically the different levels of lens distortion we're able to see, the different qualities we're getting when we are changing between those field of views, and again, a lot of that distortion on the Hero4 Silver when we are in that sort of super view mode. So like I mentioned before, simply zooming in on an image sensor doesn't really remove lens distortion, we're just sort of obscuring it from the side. Now both of these cameras do have the slight ability to actually correct for lens distortion, basically sort of mathematically reverse the footage towards the edges of the frame, that way everything appears to be more in a straight line instead of curving off at the end. Now with the Garmin Virb-XE, we can actually do this in the camera and it's called lens correct. The Hero4 Silver does not have this built in, but we can use the free GoPro Hero Studio software to remove lens distortion, and you can see as we sort of flip back and forth here what type of a difference it makes. Now we're actually going to lose part of the sides of the frame because in part of correcting the footage, we're actually stretching the footage past its original filming area, and then the camera is digitally cropping it for us. That way we don't have weird distorted edges past that line. And with the Garmin Virb-XE, you can actually turn on lens correct in any of its different field of view options. So no matter if we're in wide, medium, or narrow field of view, we will remove a lot of that lens distortion, but do keep in mind if we are going to its zoom or ultra zoom levels, we're going to be cropping out more of our plate. So the field of view that we think we're filming on, we can accidentally easily cut something out. But it's a really nice way to quickly film something and not have to worry about undistorting the footage yourself. But again, the Hero4 Silver can do it, it's just you need to do it in post. And we're just quickly cycling between medium field of view and wide field of view on the Hero4 Silver, so you can see basically the differences of what just cropping on the image sensor is as opposed to just actually reversing the lens distortion towards the edges. So now that we've seen how options like field of view or lens correction can affect our footage, I really want to go over the image quality differences between both of these cameras, and that's probably the main reason why you're here watching this video. Now before I get too deep into it, I want to explain why the Hero4 Silver is set to 2.7K instead of me taking the settings down to 1920 by 1080, which is the max the Garmin Virb can go at 16 by 9. Now on both sides of your screen you have the Hero4 Silver being displayed, one at 2.7K and one at 1920 by 1080. When we're filming at 2.7K, we have a lot more detail in our quality. If you look at the text or the skids on the helicopter on the 1920 by 1080 on the right side, you're going to notice a lot more anti-aliasing. While on the 2.7K side, everything's a lot crisper and there's a lot more detail and information. So if we drop the Hero4 Silver's resolution down to 1920 by 1080 to match the Garmin Virb-XE, it would actually put the Hero4 Silver at a disadvantage because it is capable of achieving something better. So let's switch back to comparing the Hero4 Silver against the Garmin Virb-XE. Now, both of these cameras have a very similar color profile. You can see that on the left and the right, both have very rich saturated colors. When we zoom in here, you can notice the blue and the detail in the sky, and even the field of view focus on the back is very similar, even at 2.7K versus the Virb-XE. If we zoom in here, unlike the Hero4 Silver when we're looking at that at 1920 by 1080, there's not a lot of aliasing going on the Garmin Virb-XE, but we are seeing a bit of grain pop up even when we're zoomed in here at 200%. The image is a little bit softer as opposed to the Hero4 Silver, which isn't really scaling up. It's sort of natively at 100% there. Now we switched over to a flat color mode, which both of these cameras offer, and this is for color correction in post. The Virb-XE definitely is giving us a little more range, while the Hero4 Silver is sort of retaining some of that saturation here. But both of these deliver great results when you want to do color correction in post. If you look at the black values and things like the tire well, we're not crunching down all of those black values so that they disappear. There's definitely a lot more range to play around with there, and when we start messing with things like LUTs and curves, we're gonna have some really nice results from both of these cameras. One of the big selling points to the Garmin Virb-XE is the ability to film in 1440 mode. 1440p is basically a taller 4x3 frame, which allows us a little more field of view at the top and the bottom. Now, previously, the Hero4 Silver was, basically the GoPro line was one of the few cameras that offered a sort of taller mode, which is really good for tight spaces or if you're surfing, because you can get just such a taller perspective, and then you don't have to worry so much about tilting the camera too far low or too far high, because in the post, we can sort of recrop it down to a 1920 by 1080 image. However, if you notice here, when we actually switch to 1440p mode on the Garmin Virb-XE, there is a big quality loss. Look at things like the railing on the top of the car here. We're at 1920 and we're going to switch to 1440. There's a lot of aliasing coming in the Virb-XE. Now, we're not seeing the same quality loss from the Hero4 Silver. We're basically staying nice and crisp on the Hero4 Silver, while the Virb-XE becomes a little softer. We get these little aliasing lines. It's a big bummer, especially if you're someone who really wants to film in 1440p like me, just because we're losing quality. So I would want to stay at 1920 by 1080. But I'm losing a lot of the options that 1440p would allow for me, such as recropping my image later, in case, again, we're too low or too high, because 1440p is a great perspective if we're doing things like mountain biking, because we can put it on our chest, and we don't have to worry about tilting the camera too far low or too far high. We'll capture everything from the ground all the way to the sky, and you can see when we're zoomed in here at 200%, just the big quality difference, especially compared to the Hero4 Silver on your left. Things like the text, and again, that railing, the roof rack, is definitely losing a lot of quality. Again, when we switch to 1920 back and forth here, you can just see that roof railing just pop back and be really crisp, and then just go back to being aliasing. However, despite some quality loss, 1440p definitely does have some advantages. Here we are filming in a really tight sort of scenario. Maybe I would have had the camera too high and I would have lost all of that console information, or I maybe don't want the console information. I want basically just the outdoor of this helicopter up in the sky. We have the ability to recrop that on later, and if we're not really looking for things like anti-aliasing lines, these are things that are easily overlooked. It's just when they're pointed out to you, you kind of know what to look for. Now, while the Garmin Virb-XE is powered on, it's actually recording a bunch of information from your adventure. So we're recording things right now such as elevation, G-force, GPS, and we're able to display speed and stuff like that. And we can actually hook it up to a bunch of Garmin external sensors, such as a heartbeat sensor. And then all of this footage can be overlaid on top of your adventure footage using the Garmin Virb Edit software. Now, we go into this a lot in our Virb Edit software video. You'll see a link for it at the end of this video. It's really easy and straightforward. It's easy to record a bunch of information and display it on top of the footage. You even have the ability to render out PNGs if you wanted to overlay that with other footage from multiple cameras, and it's recording the information on one solid file. Even though you might have taken 19 different clips, as long as the camera stays powered on, it's recording that one single track, and then you apply that track to that footage and it automatically links up, and it's really simple. Now, that strobing line you're seeing on the Hero4 Silver and vaguely on the Virb-XE, that's actually sort of not a rolling shutter, but it's the rotor and the light sort of bouncing into the lens and creating sort of a strobing effect as we're sort of filming with the camera tilted up just a little too high. If you have this camera sort of permanently mounted, you can create something like a mat, and sort of cut down on some of that screen glare to kind of reduce that effect. Now, both of these cameras, again, are filming at 1440p. With the Virb-XE, we actually have a built-in stabilizer. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, the Sony action camera has a big selling point of having a built-in stabilizer. Now, the Virb-XE stabilizer isn't as intense as the Sony Action Cam. While I rated the Sony Action Cam as reducing maybe 65 to 75% of the vibration, the Virb-XE is basically removing maybe 30 to 40%. But what this does for us is it doesn't add a lot of a lot of warping towards the edges. You'll notice basically if we're looking at the console here, it's not shaking nearly as much as the Hero4 Silver, but we're definitely not as stabilized as something like the Action Cam. But again, we don't see any of that warping at all, and we're barely losing any field of view when we do have stabilization turned on. And we can actually enable stabilization on any field of view and any resolution. So 1440, 1080p, 60 frames a second, wide, zoom, narrow, all of those are options. Now with the Hero4 Silver, we don't have a built-in stabilizer, and there is nothing in the GoPro Hero4 Studio software that can do this for us. So it's basically up to us to use external software such as After Effects to remove some of that jitter. So if you're someone that likes to film at higher frame rates and keep all of your footage super smooth, the Hero4 Silver definitely keeps a better quality at higher frame rates, such as 60 and 120 frames per second. Now we're going to drop the footage here to about 25%. So instead of playing back at 120 frames a second like we just were, we're now displaying it back at 30 frames a second. So we're at 1/4 the speed we were going. The Hero4 Silver will definitely maintain its quality in this mode. Now at 120 frames per second, we can only achieve a 720p resolution, but our edges are going to be nice and sharp on the Hero4 Silver. They're going to be a little soft, not as crisp again as we're filming at 1080p or 2.7K, but compared to the 720 on the Garmin Virb, we're seeing a lot of aliasing. If you look at sort of the cockpit lines where we have those harsh edges, you'll notice there's a bit of aliasing going on there. But again, both of these cameras achieving 720p at 120 frames per second. The quality looks pretty good. Now, despite some of my issues with the Garmin's ability to display really good edges at 1440, it's really good at sort of color balance. Now, if you look at the red area on the upper right of your screen on the Hero4 Silver, we're seeing a lot of crunching values. We have these very harsh edges that create these sort of pixely areas. This is actually a big problem in a lot of action cameras, especially when we're filming a brightly saturated blue sky. If you look on the Hero4 Silver, we get that sort of crispy sort of edge that's sort of dancing around, but on the Garmin Virb-XE, it's really good at balancing colors and sort of smoothly gradiating into the next set of values. Now, while you're not always going to run into those sort of really crunch values that create that sort of crunchiness edge, if you are in certain conditions, they do seem to appear a lot more than often. If you are filming during the day where there's like clear blue skies, maybe something at a beach during the day a lot, you're going to see those values happen a lot. But as you notice here, we're looking up at the sky. We don't have a lot of those crunchy values because it's not a brightly saturated area that's actually bright. Now, we do have a lot of saturated areas here, but they're fairly dark and they're not really crunching those values too much. Now, if you look on the left, the Hero4 Silver, again, doing an amazing quality, just displaying all those little dots. The Virb-XE was just a little bit too soft, and both of these cameras right now are filming at 1920 by 1080 for those of you that were interested in what the quality differences were on both of these. Now, for me, at 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second, the Virb-XE, this is its maximum potential. The quality that you get out of 1080p is better than if you were to film at 1440p currently in the initial launch firmware. The Hero4 Silver, again, we're filming at 1920 by 1080, but we do have the potential to go even further, and we can do 2.7K and have a much crisper image. So now we're going to listen to a sound test using the built-in microphones of both of these cameras. The Hero4 Silver is in its frame case, so there's nothing obstructing the mic, and the Virb-XE is built into its case, so there's no way we can really remove it.
We don't have to time it. We can rock it right now, man. Have a party in a bank, Cadillac, rose velvet seats, riding in the back, cruising down the street, waving to the girls, feeling out of sight, spending all my money on a Saturday night. Honey, I just wanna what you doing.
So the Hero4 Silver has a really great and powerful range in audio. You can especially hear it when we hit those sort of bassy tones. Now the Garmin Virb is a little more tinny and muffled, but that's because it's built into a dive housing. Now right out of the box, the Virb-XE can dive up to 50 meters. The Hero4 Silver needs to be put into a dive case, but luckily both of these cameras do have a flat lens, so our underwater quality is going to be very sharp and crisp. And you can see that here when we freeze on the frame. Take a look at my hair on the left as we're filming in 1440p on both of these cameras. The Silver definitely definitely has a lot of really nice quality in that hair. It's nice and crisp. On the Virb-XE, you can notice it's a little muddy, sort of anti-aliasing again. But again, if we switch it to 1080p and have both of these at a 16:9 aspect ratio, you can see a quality improvement in both of these. And you can see the Virb-XE is doing a really good job of introducing a little more red to make our plate a little more balanced. The Hero4 Silver doesn't really push the red channel as much, and as a result, we're left with a little more blue. Now, we could put on a red filter onto the Hero4 Silver. We don't really have filter options or color options in the Virb-XE. The only thing we could do is manually adjust the white balance in some of the pro settings. And you'll notice here when we pull the Virb-XE out of the water, a lot of that red detail sort of stays locked onto that camera, and it's a little hard to get that sort of red tint to go away until you're away from the water for a little bit. Now through this section, we've been switching through some of the frame rate options and resolution options. For me, the differences are minuscule. They are basically on par with what we've been saying before. The higher the frame rate we go, the Hero4 Silver definitely sort of maintains quality, but as we go higher frame rates, they both lose some of their crispness. Now, if we freeze here on 60 frames a second, again, take a look at the quality of the bubbles on the Hero4 Silver. We definitely have a lot more information there. It's much sharper and crisper as opposed to the Virb-XE. So we've talked a lot in the past about the difficulties of filming at night with action cameras. Now the problem is they use these very small image sensors, and since they're so small, they don't collect light as well as night. We just basically don't have a big surface to collect as much light in a short amount of time. We've actually sped up the footage here on the left because I wanted to show you on the Hero4 Silver there's this weird rolling black bar that's happening at night, and it's particularly in this shot only, but if you look basically at the sort of driveway in the bottom, you'll see it roll up over and over. It's very faint, but the faster you make the footage, it's there, but it's not something you would notice unless you're sort of scrubbing through the footage. Now, I mentioned before that we have some options for artificially boosting up the light, and that's the ISO, and what we're doing is we're basically taking the grain, and we're basically boosting it up a little bit artificially, and we're basically saying every pixel here get a little brighter. The problem is this introduces a ton more noise, which is why I generally like to keep it at 1600. Now at the time of recording this, the Hero4 Silver did just put out a firmware version 3.0, which actually gives us some more ISO control. Originally we were only able to do 400, 1600, and 6400, but they've added an 800 ISO and a 3200 ISO, which should help you control the grain a lot more and basically find a nice new balance for your low light shots. Now you can see here when we have 6400 ISO, things like that sign in the upper left are very hard to read. They get very bloomed out, and again, we introduce a ton of grain. But when we bring it down to 1600, that sign becomes a little more readable, but it also kind of puts things into perspective. If you want to use these cameras as a dash camera, filming at night is very tough, so capturing things like license plates on illuminated license plate, they're generally going to be blown out, and if you're filming at sort of field of views that are wide, it's really hard to read those license plates because they're going to be really small and really pixelated. Like we have this license plate here in the lower left, it's nearly impossible to read. If we were filming this as a dash cam, I would really highly recommend keeping your field of view at medium and keeping your frame rate at least 30 frames per second. Now with the Hero4 Silver, we can do a few things to sort of make the low light look a little better. We could turn it down to 24 frames per second, but that's only good if we don't have a ton of motion. But it will allow the image sensor to collect a little more light per frame. So when it comes down to quality at night with both of these cameras, they do a fairly good job in city light conditions. However, if you're gonna go anything darker than that, it's gonna be really hard to read an image. Quality-wise, I feel both of these are fairly on par with one another. The color will change depending on your location and shot, but the only really big difference I had with the Virb-XE was when we were filming near cooler bulbs, like incandescent lighting at that gas station in the original shot. The blue values got really crunchy and did some weird things. Now both of these cameras have a 4x3 12 megapixel image sensor. These cameras do a really good job of taking really still photography. The Hero4 Silver definitely has a little more control. You can adjust things like shutter value, which is really good for low light conditions. It has an auto shutter. We can manually change the shutter speed, which makes filming in low light amazing. We do some really cool things. The Garmin Virb has an auto shutter that's actually really good for low light. It will automatically keep the shutter open a little longer, making our really pitch dark shots actually have some sort of meaningful value, but we can't really change the shutter speed manually. We do have time-lapse options, burst options, and both of these cameras have a physical button we can press when we want to take the photo. In fact, the Garmin Virb-XE actually has a separate tactile button that we can actually flip forward when we want to film, and then we have a separate button when we want to push down to take a photo, and if we hold it down, it'll switch it to its either burst or time-lapse option depending on what you changed in the settings. Now the Hero4 Silver has an LCD screen on the back, which makes it much easier to use at night and actually preview a lot of these nighttime photos. And a lot of these nighttime photos you're seeing were extremely dark, to the point where I thought the Virb-XE would show how dark it is, but it's doing a really good job of just keeping that shutter open longer. You're actually seeing a lot of the same shots that we filmed with video, and you could just go back to a lot of those shots and just realize how much darker they were before we took the photo. So I think both these cameras do a really good job of photography, and they have some really great options, especially when it comes to user interface and button presses. But if you want to see these photos in full resolution, you can actually download them from the more information section below this video. There's a link that'll have every one of these images you just saw on your screen for yourself, and you can compare them in full res. Anyway, with that, we're wrapping up our quick look of the GoPro Hero4 Silver up against the Garmin Virb-XE, but before you go, just want to point out that the G-Metrics and Virb Edit software that we mentioned earlier in the video, you can see all that in the link in the upper left of your screen. It's some pretty amazing stuff. And speaking of amazing stuff, just want to say a big thanks to Santa Barbara Heli Tours and my buddy Mike for hooking me up with a very last-minute helicopter tour around Santa Barbara. Schedule a tour with them today. They're going to give you an amazing adventure. I also want to know what you guys think of the GoPro Hero4 Silver. It's definitely still one of my top recommended cameras. Leave your comments in the section below. Be sure to like and subscribe because it helps me in the search results so much, and it helps a lot more people see videos like this. You can also check out MarkHawkCam.com, which we just newly launched. Put a ton of work into that, and just maybe head on over to my Patreon page and maybe we'll make a weekly goal of $10 a month. Anyway, I'm having a blast doing these. Thank you so much for watching this far into the video. I'm MarkHawk, and I'll see you out there. Have a good one, everyone.